Well, folks, this is my gist of the situation today, he began his peroration. We shall have to stand firm, even if it hurts. Yet I am no pessimist. He knew that pessimists are not paid $2,000 a night on American radio. At least not for long. And I can see faint signs on the horizon. They point... Just a minute, folks. Here's a message just come in. He had halted for a second. When he spoke again, he forgot his high-powered acting and spoke naturally and sincerely. Bad news. An American aircraft has crashed in Germany. It was challenged by a Russian fighter and forced down. All the passengers were killed. Among them was Bob Glory, who was touring Europe entertaining the American troops. You don't need me to tell you folks that this could be very serious.
Welcome to Our Nuclear Nightmares, a series examining the literature of the nuclear age. The following program contains material and themes that some listeners may find disturbing. Discretion is advised. Episode 5. Shoot. The year is 1949. The Kingdom of Greece, run primarily by former collaborators and pro-fascists and backed by the United States and Britain, defeats a democratic army of Greece which is backed by Yugoslavia. Over 150,000 are killed in the conflict, and 1 million Greeks become refugees. Mao Zedong officially proclaims the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square, although fighting with the Republic of China will continue for months as it retreats to Taiwan. The Civil War has lasted over 18 years and caused the deaths of over 10 million soldiers and civilians. The Soviet Union detonates its first nuclear weapon at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The test is detected by the United States and later announced by President Truman. It comes as a shock both to the public and experts who had predicted the Soviet Union was years away from a successful test. Shoot was written by Bernard Newman and first published in the United Kingdom by Victor Gallants Limited. Shoot begins with Walt driving his wife Helen and their child to a drive-in theater for a movie. Walt is an almost cliché ideal of an American, married with a child, middle class, veteran of the Second World War, and filled with patriotic thoughts, although with the occasional creeping doubts, such as a complaint about profiteering and the rising cost of medical care. As the family settles in at the drive-in, they turn on the radio and hear a news flash that American and Soviet planes exchange fire over the German border. One of the American planes involved crashed, killing everyone aboard, including the famous singer Bob Glory. The novel then introduces Bobby, a young British man whose future has been decided by his parents and who has gone to all the right schools. He has been notified of his call-up into the army, but is not worried, only vaguely upset that will interrupt time with his girlfriend Pam. The novel then introduces Alexis, a farmer working in the Soviet Union who expresses sharp questions regarding the pronouncements from the party. He is coming back from tending his vegetable patch when he encounters his brother Serge, a firm believer in the communist state who reads out a column from the Pravda newspaper about the clash between American and Soviet planes. The novel next moves to the cellar of a bombed-out building in the ruins of Hamburg, Germany, which serves as the abode of the Gerhardt family. The family is struggling to survive through black market work and odd jobs. Frau Gerhardt is talking to her neighbor Herr Fritsch about their situation when police barge in looking for her son Emil, who they say is wanted for crimes against the state. The next scene is a meeting of the Politburo at the Kremlin, where, after a speech from the Commissar from Foreign Affairs, the leaders argue about what steps to take regarding the increase in tensions. They eventually settle on preparing for a clash but still want to avoid provoking a war. The scene shifts to the White House, where the president is answering questions from journalists who are pressing him to make a strong statement.
The president had committed himself to the statement that he would make a formal protest to Russia when he received the report. This did not satisfy his intended audience. Questions still poured in. The press is a powerful agent in America, and in this case it was indeed representing the people. The president was concerned. "All right, boys," he conceded. "I'll tell you this off the record. The Army staff is considering the possibility of supplying fighter escorts to our aircraft flying anywhere near Russian-controlled territory." This was enough. Just what the boys wanted. They would now write articles urging the use of fighter escorts. Then, when the escorts were provided, they would point to their own predictions and the power and influence of their newspapers.
The next scene is a meeting of the Cominform, the shorthand name for the Information Bureau of Communist and Workers' Parties, a short-lived successor to the Comintern, and served as an alliance of various European communist parties. The Commissar from Foreign Affairs appears again to chair the meeting, and to direct the members to create confusion and sabotage the war efforts of their respective countries. The plan is overheard by a British intelligence asset who hurriedly returns to England to relay the information. The British cabinet meets to gravely discuss what they have learned, and despite several suggestions, there is little hope they can prevent another war. As the Exchequer leaves the meeting, he comments that if the United Kingdom enters the war, even if it wins, it will be ruined, much like what happened in the Second World War. The next scene introduces Mr. Polaner and Mr. Rosenbaum, who are Soviet agents with orders to steal advanced ballistic missiles. The next scene introduces Mr. Polaner and Mr. Rosenbaum, who are Soviet agents with orders to steal advanced ballistic missile controls from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a huge government-run nuclear research center located in Tennessee. It also says Nazi Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and General Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, after the capture at Stalingrad, were persuaded to form a Soviet army unit, but this is not quite accurate. Seydlitz did have a league of German officers that put forward a proposal to create such a unit, but Soviet officials never gave it serious consideration. Paulus and Seydlitz also formed a national committee for a free Germany with other Nazi military officers, but produced nothing more than speeches and pamphlets. The fictional Ritwitz tells his compatriots that the clash they had long expected between the Americans and Soviets is coming, and that they will exploit the situation to free Germany from outside control, regardless of what the Soviets want. The meeting is found out by British and American spies who obtain full plans and details. There is a series of quick scenes after this. Bobby getting a marriage proposal from his girlfriend, Walt and Alexis reading newspapers that are agitating for war, and the acting secretary of the United Nations lamenting how the Americans and Soviets are acting like idiots. Then there's news that there's been another violent encounter between Soviet and American aircraft. The novel then moves to a meeting between Germans who are part of General Ritwitz's group, and who want to spark a full-scale conflict by assassinating Russian General Tobolowsky. They plan to use a patsy to perform the killing, have him killed, and plant information incriminating the Americans. The name of the patsy is Emil Gerhardt. Later, Walt and his wife listen to a radio broadcast of news of the successful assassination and commenters demanding retaliation. Walt tries to reassure his wife when a letter arrives with his call-up notice. The scene shifts to the British House of Commons, where the Prime Minister is answering questions and dealing with heckling from the back benches.
Is it not a fact that Europe has virtually been in a state of war for some time, an undeclared war involving continuous incidents and fifth column activities? The Prime Minister: This is almost correct. I have emphasized that in older days more precise definitions of war and peace prevailed, and certain formalities usually preceded open hostilities. Today it could indeed be argued that we have continuously been at war since 1939, the so-called Cold War replacing the more open conflict of 1945. We have pointed out times without number that this partisan strife could lead automatically and almost indefinably into something much more serious.
The question and answer session is interrupted by news that the Soviets are demanding complete control of Berlin and evacuation of the American and British forces. The speed of events has rattled some members of the Politburo, several of whom want to avoid war. They listen to a report that says their agents in the Western European countries are ready to engage in sabotage and strikes when the war breaks out. However, one member expresses concern they may not be in complete control of Eastern Europe. The Soviet army goes on the offensive in Berlin, attacking the American, British, and French sectors and pushing out the Allies who lack armor and heavy weapons. The Soviets quickly gain complete control to the dismay of the German populace, which dislike the Allies but detest the Soviets. Rumors start to go around about a special event causing Germans to turn out to investigate. A man near the Brandenburg Gate reports first hearing music, and then seeing soldiers in German uniforms marching down the street accompanied by tanks and artillery, led by a man on a horse who calls on everyone to reunify Germany. There is a meeting of the United Nations Security Council with charges and countercharges that achieves nothing. Meanwhile, Bobby's unit is tasked with interfacing with the local Germans to help create a defensive line on the Rhine against a possible Soviet attack, and discuss having to dynamite plants and evacuate people. After the meeting, a German sneaks out and informs the local communists about the sabotage plans. The scene shifts to Poland and introduces Stanislaus, a member of the Polish resistance, who decides to sabotage the Soviet military by blowing up several of the key bridges around Warsaw. The action moves to a refugee camp containing several different nationalities. Some, such as the Estonians and Hungarians, are unwilling to return to their Soviet-controlled nations. A false rumor that the Soviets are advancing on the camp sets off a mass panic and exodus. The refugees are described as a swarm, attacking and looting everything in their path until orders are given by American officers to shoot to kill. Alexis and his brother Serge are given orders to join the army, which Serge receives with enthusiasm while Alexis and his wife Sonia express doubts. Back in the United States, Polaner and Rosenbaum take part in an attack on the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and manage to destroy part of the facility. Rosenbaum is killed in the process, and the FBI find documents on some of the bodies linking them to the Russian embassy military attaché. Sometime later, the chief of the U.S. staff briefs the Congress committee on the overall oil situation with attention on the Middle East. The Oak Ridge attack raises outrage in the United States. No one believes the Soviet claim that it was a false flag operation.
There were riots and other incidents in many parts of the United States. The usual organizations, on the claim that most of the Russian leaders were Jews, raised the inevitable anti-Semitic storm. One section concentrated its attack on Wall Street where, as it happens, Jewish representation is meager. Mostly the demonstration consisted of the breaking of Jewish traders' windows by gallant mobs. The radio commentators excelled each other in their demands for the internment of all the Reds, a term sufficiently elastic to include any personal opponents. The ordinary people were utterly confused. Was it war, or was it not?
The Soviet-controlled German government demands that the Allies leave West Germany, their proposal ending with the Nazi line of "One people, one Reich." The reaction of the British government is to grimly recognize the West German government and to reform its army. On the Rhine, Bobby and his unit have to deal with workers who are occupying the mine to prevent them from blowing it up and denying it to the Soviets. The troops push the workers out and face down a deliberate attempt by infiltrators to start a fight that would make them open fire. Walt arrives in Germany and joins a unit that is camped out at a factory. Unknown to them, they are the target of a Soviet plot to poison their stew and wreck their ability to fight. Unfortunately, a local child whom the soldiers have unofficially adopted eats the stew, which kills her. This sends the troops into a rage, and they march into the factory and kill any communist they can find. Alexis finds himself part of another Soviet plot, with his unit dressed in German uniforms so they can attack and gain a strategic advantage, while the Soviets can deny they are engaged in any combat. The plan fails, with the disguised Soviet push defeated, and despite orders to kill himself, Alexis allows himself to be taken captive by British troops. The novel cycles through several government meetings, starting with the Americans who complain about the British reticence for war. Then to China, where the Prime Minister, though more accurately the character should be called the Premier, recommends that China does not become involved in the conflict.
Are the Russians communists? Asked the Prime Minister. I find no trace of communism among them. They merely use the creed to further their own ends. But our end is not theirs. When they supported us in our Revolutionary War, they believed that they would absorb us. They did not know China. The time will come when we absorb them. 10 years we allowed for our consolidation of power, you remember. Our economic progress is good thanks to the Americans, who will cheerfully arm even their opponents under the banner of trade. But we have still much to do.
The Japanese cabinet shares the same views as the Chinese about staying out of the fighting, so they can then take advantage of their weakened opponents after the war. In Germany, Bobby's unit exchanges fire with Soviet forces. They are ordered to withdraw but manage to cost the Soviets a delay and inflict heavy casualties. The Soviet generals argue over their lack of progress and resources, not knowing that one of the German staff has planted a bomb in the room. Pure chance allows one of the generals to survive the explosion. He swiftly deduces how the bombing was carried out, and the German staff member is found and executed. The French military is well prepared but suspicious of internal sabotage, fears that are confirmed when they capture a Soviet soldier trying to cross the lines to deliver a message about a Operation K, which is a signal to all communist agents to fight against the government. In Paris, another group of communist agents stage an armed uprising against the government but are bloodily defeated, but the fighting causes chaos in supply logistics that badly hampers the French military. The American forces are meanwhile able to cause the Soviets significant losses but are inexorably being pushed back. Eventually, the Soviets reach Fontainebleau, where a general announces they will next attack Spain and Britain. The Soviets also manage to assault and occupy Denmark, Norway, and Finland, and after a struggle, Sweden as well. The attack on Britain takes the form of a massive naval force that sneaks past the British fleet and lands troops in Ireland. The novel makes an odd claim that the Soviets were not aware of the partition of Ireland, something the real Soviet Union was very aware of as they frequently criticized the British occupation of Northern Ireland. This is followed by the frankly ludicrous claim that, quote, partition was not such a big deal, unquote, and the Irish unified to push the Soviets out of Ireland. Throughout the conflict, the American president is pressured to authorize the use of nuclear weapons, but demurs.
I don't need to tell you that the idea of finishing off the war in 5 minutes is all ballyhoo, he said. 100 atomic bombs could not do that. They could slaughter hundreds of thousands of Russians, but the Soviet attitude to human life is not quite the same as ours. Further, we know that her essential industries are widely dispersed, and it is obvious that she intends to develop those in France and Germany.
The president changes his mind when an American official in Turkey witnesses what he believes is a nuclear strike and cables Washington to that effect, not realizing that what he saw was the explosion of an oil facility due to an earthquake. An Air Force bomber squadron armed with nuclear bombs is dispatched to hit Soviet-controlled oil fields. During the attack, a secret communist cell that has infiltrated the Air Force takes over one of the bombers, brings it down, and makes away with the nuclear technology so that Soviet scientists can reverse engineer it. Unfortunately for them, their garbled message that, quote, the Americans have come, unquote, causes a village filled with peasants sympathetic to the Soviets to come out and kill the crew. The war continues with the Soviets making slow gains, but things start to unravel after an American agent parachutes into occupied France and assists resistance fighters in carrying out a campaign of terror that decimates a collaborating government. The idea spreads to other occupied countries and forces the Soviets to divert more troops to maintain control of the territories. The United States installs rocket bases in Scotland and Spain that starts to inflict damage on the Soviet Union. The Soviets respond, firing rockets into England until the government is forced out of London by the bombardment. The Soviets attack America next by sending a submarine carrying a nuclear weapon into New York City harbor and detonating it.
Hollywood in its wildest dreams never pictured such scenes. It was impossible to check the panic. The unknown is a frightful enemy. As the atomic mist drifted over the city, thousands of people collapsed with violent vomiting. Whole streets of houses were in ruin. Others were blazing furiously. The great cloud, reaching far into the sky, seemed to be billowing as if subjected to a series of endless though noiseless explosions.
The damage is severe and compounded by panic that grips the populace who rushes away from the site. The United States responds by firing nuclear missiles at Moscow and several other Soviet cities. The president also orders the evacuation of American cities along the west and east coasts. Soon after, another Soviet submarine detonates its nuclear payload outside Washington, while two more hit Los Angeles and San Francisco. Soviet bombers hit England, destroying Lewisham, Liverpool, and London. Meanwhile, Alexis is abandoned by the retreating British soldiers and left to fend for himself. He comes across a pamphlet by the Narodno Trudiev Soyuz, or the National Alliance of Russian Solidarists. The organization was established by white émigrés at the end of the Russian Civil War and proclaimed a deliberately vague Christian-based ideology mostly defined by its opposition to socialism. The organization carried out attacks inside the Soviet Union before and during the Second World War, while allied with the Russian National Liberation Movement. The novel also credits them with assassinating Sergei Kirov, the first secretary of the Leningrad Communist Party, but there has never been any evidence for this claim. The NTS pamphlet causes Alexis trouble when advancing Soviet troops capture him and discover it in his pocket. He is condemned as a counter-revolutionary and deported to a labor camp in Siberia, where one of the officers admits they will be fed enough for 3 years, after which they will be allowed to die. This convinces Alexis that he must do something, so he forms an NTS cell in the camp. Meanwhile, the Soviets defeat an Allied offensive at the Pyrenees and then conquer Italy, already riven by internal strife, then Greece. The Chinese, without Soviet consultation, demand Burma and Indochina from France. The Soviets are suffering issues with supplies for the military, especially oil, and therefore make plans to attack Persia and Iraq. The ray is tested in Iraq, where it causes Soviet vehicles to stop functioning and then disintegrate, with a similarly unpleasant effect on the soldiers. The situation is still dire in England, though, where Soviet missiles continue to fall and the government introduces increasingly draconian measures to maintain control.
However, once the newspapers took the government line, they had no options, as the few recalcitrants found. Now the USA was geared for action, all out for victory. 100 well-used patriotic phrases were paraded for general consumption. There were local troubles, but the new internal security police proved its efficiency, and the men who promoted strikes found themselves working at the same bench as the men who had rigged markets.
At the prison camp, Alexis's resistance cell has been bolstered by trained infiltrators who are parachuted in by American aircraft and sneak past the barbed wire. They are instrumental in the subsequent uprising by prisoners who overwhelm the guards at dozens of camps. Soon they have most of eastern Siberia under control and declare it the nation of New Russia. The uprising has knock-on effects. South Korean forces advance across the border, defeating the weakened North Korean army and declaring a united Korea. Japan also takes advantage of Soviet weakness and attacks, while China is roiled by a series of rebellions. The Polish resistance suffers a setback and has to retreat into the forest, but continues to fight effectively. The novel shifts back to the Pyrenees, where the first atomic bullet is tested in battle and proves able to vaporize an entire tank. The United States is then offered and accepts a daring plan from General Hoffmann in Germany. The plan is activated when the Soviets put the German Republican Army into battle, only for every member to turn around and open fire on the Soviets instead. The shock causes a rout that turns into a total retreat as Soviet forces are pushed out of France entirely and other occupied countries. Poland is hit by hundreds of uprisings and acts of sabotage. However, the use of nuclear weapons has caused problems with morale in many countries, particularly the United States and Britain, which are turning more fascist.
To add to the confusion, world food supplies were seriously reduced by the extent of the fighting and by the effects of atomic warfare. Scientists had long warned that climate and crops might be affected by indiscriminate atomic activity, and they proved to be right. Serious floods and earthquakes were reported from the USA and Russia, and in southeastern England large areas were underwater. Huge expanses of ground went out of cultivation as a result of atomic effects.
The Soviets, starting to feel pressure from the economic strain, supply problems, and nuclear strikes, make noise about peace negotiations. However, the American military is suspicious of the offer and wants to pile on more pressure. Meanwhile, General Hoffmann asks permission to unleash his secret weapon. Sometime later, Bobby's parents are arguing about the news from the front.
So when her husband began his familiar and irritating performance, she relapsed into her knitting. Suddenly, a great blast filled the room. Mr. Telson had turned the volume knob by mistake. "My Germans," a harsh voice boomed. "The hour of destiny is at hand. I have returned to you, as you knew I would." "Oh, turn it down," Miss Telson pleaded. "That voice," her husband shouted. "Did you hear it?" "I could hardly help hearing it, could I? But I don't understand that foreign gibberish," she complained. "Every German man and woman to the battle," the voice shouted. "Rid our beloved land of these barbarians." "That voice, don't you recognize it? That's Hitler."
The voice of Hitler causes consternation among the Allies, who argue over whether he somehow survived the fall of Berlin or if it's an actor. The effect is immediate on the German people, who begin to rise up all over the country and fight the Soviets. The Soviets are also suffering more rebellions in the occupied Baltic states and Poland. As Bobby's unit advances on Berlin, he comments that they fought the fascists who were replaced by the Soviets, who are now being replaced by more fascists. Meanwhile, one of the Soviet generals secretly contacts Allied command and hints at where the Politburo is meeting, allowing them to wipe out Soviet leadership in a nuclear strike. As the new Soviet government begins peace negotiations, Walt's unit moves into the ruins of Minsk, which has suffered a nuclear hit, and the civilians show signs of radiation burns. Walt laments to another soldier about how absurd it was that the war started over the death of Bob Glory. The soldier replies he has never heard of Bob Glory. The scene then shifts to a movie screening room at a Hollywood studio, and the entire preceding story is revealed to have been a movie. The director is Sam Silberstein, who has screened the film for a select group of critics and offers it as a cautionary tale about the horrors of war. The critics, who are set up as obvious strawmen, make a number of complaints.
Unfortunately, a pattern had been set. In turn, a dozen representatives of different societies got up to point out that their particular organization had not been mentioned in the film. We had to listen to Douglas creditors, anti-Jews, Zionists, single taxers, internationalists, America Firsters, the Zetetic Society who gallantly maintain the earth is flat, the nudists, and the Daughters of the American Revolution, to say nothing of the Ku Klux Klan.
The complaints continue for several pages, with the director puncturing holes in them and arguing the film was not created as entertainment but as a warning. One of the more strident complaints is that the film is completely unrealistic. As the director starts to reply, he has passed a note which says Soviet fighters intercepted an American plane near the German border, causing a crash that killed everyone on board, including the singer Bob Glory. Shoot is a fast-paced, darkly comic war novel. The start of the conflict is based on real tensions that were growing between Soviet and Allied occupation forces in Germany, particularly around Berlin. The alliance between America and Britain and the Soviet Union had been one of necessity, and once it became clear that they had effectively won the war by 1943, they engaged in strategies to solidify their spheres of influence for the post-war world. Germany was a particular source of tension. Neither the Soviet Union nor the United States wanted a united Germany, but both wanted it to serve as a buffer against the other. The Americans wanted to stabilize the economy and make it self-sufficient and reduce their occupation responsibilities. The Soviets wanted to strip factories and other assets for reparations, and devalue the currency to prevent it from becoming an industrial threat. These conflicting political objectives worsened the already dire economic situation, especially in divided Berlin. When the British, French, and Americans introduced a new currency, the Soviets reacted by blockading Berlin, expecting that the Allies would shy away from a military confrontation and either negotiate a new economic policy or leave the city. Instead, the Allies embarked on a massive airlift to keep the city supplied, eventually totaling 2,500,000 tons and 300,000 flights. Although Soviet planes occasionally harassed Allied deliveries, no one opened fire, but there was understandable concern that something could happen and turn it into a conflagration. The Joint Chiefs created two war plans called Bushwhacker and Half Moon for implementation in case of a Soviet invasion. Both relied on a strategic air campaign. Half Moon would be updated in 1949 and retitled Trojan, and it called for the use of 133 nuclear weapons on 70 Soviet cities. The bombs would have been stationed in England so they would be secure from a possible Soviet attack, but also because there was significant resistance to having them on German soil due to lingering suspicion. This is what helps the moment that the Free German movement uses the voice of Hitler to rally the German public be such an effective piece of black comedy, as it echoed the deep distrust of the Germans. Although many leaders of the Third Reich had been convicted at the Nuremberg trials at the end of 1946, there remained over 10 million people who had been card-carrying National Socialists, and another 45 million in related organizations. The American denazification process, which sorted people by major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated, was widely considered slow and too forgiving. It did not help that many Nazis fleeing from far more stringent Soviet efforts managed to convince authorities in the West that they were persecuted anti-communists. Nor did it help when the Office of Military Government carried out surveys and found the German public was unrepentant about the war or the Holocaust, and that a majority believed that Hitler's aims had been correct. In the face of all this, American suggestions of rearming Germany as a bulwark against communism were incredibly unpopular with the public, and would remain a sore point until the 1970s. The novel also demonstrates an interesting view that leaders are rarely in control of events. The President of the United States is pressured by reporters into making a more combative statement than he planned. The members of the Politburo authorize the war despite misgivings because they believe they have to respond. In the same way, the war does not proceed according to plan for either side. Neither capitulates when subjected to massive conventional or nuclear attacks. Meanwhile, complex plans for sabotage go awry because of the smallest things, such as when a child tries the drug suit meant for the American soldiers and unexpectedly dies, alerting them to the plot. It also notes the dangers of uncertainty in war, such as when the ambassador in Turkey reports an oil field explosion as a nuclear attack, and the Americans respond before the mistake is discovered. The portrayal of nuclear weapons is erratic, echoing many unsubstantiated claims at the time, though some would turn out to be correct. The damage caused by the nuclear attacks is vividly described but inaccurate, as it would require yields in the hundreds of megatons. The effect of an underwater nuclear explosion is also incorrect. The shallow water nuclear detonation in Tess Baker during Operation Crossroads involved a 23-kiloton warhead, and while the spray of water was visually impressive, there was little damage to the ships above the surface line, as the water effectively contained the shock waves. The novel also mentions the effects of the electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear explosion. Although scientists like Enrico Fermi had theorized its existence and calculated the strength with the Trinity test, the full nature wasn't explored until 1962, when the United States Air Force carried out Starfish Prime. This was a high-altitude test that burned out streetlights and triggered alarms almost 1,000 miles away in Hawaii. An interesting section where the novel is accidentally correct is when it describes how a nuclear explosion causes an earthquake. This was considered highly unlikely for decades, as it was thought nuclear weapons lacked the power to trigger movement at fractures in the Earth's crust. However, in 2017, seismometers picked up pressure waves from a North Korean underground nuclear test, followed by a series of shear waves from a previously undiscovered fault. These were still small magnitude shakes, though, and not capable of causing intense destruction. The novel stands out for noting the damaging long-term effects of fallout, describing how the cancer rate has increased and there are noticeable mutations. There is also the insightful comment, quote, "A dead man is dead, but a man with some terrible after effect is an agent of low morale," unquote. One theme the novel shares with many others in the genre is the distrust of any peace organizations, suggesting they are funded or directly controlled by the Soviet Union. This is a smear that would be repeated in conservative political circles and newspapers for decades. This suspicion was somewhat understandable at the time the novel was published. The most recent experience Americans had with an anti-war movement was the America First Committee, an isolationist, anti-Semitic, pro-fascist organization, where many members such as Charles Lindbergh praised Hitler and the Third Reich. Yet, despite its dismissive attitude, this is a novel that abhors war and suggests that even a victory for the United States would be Pyrrhic, not only because of the destruction and fallout, but because of a much more fundamental damage. Quote, "In many ways, this was the most fantastic period of the war. It came so suddenly and to my complete surprise was received so complacently. America had escaped the worst fury of the earlier wars. We were not accustomed to national suffering. When it came, our reactions were as mixed as our ancestry. I saw more valor and self-sacrifice, cowardice and selfishness than at any other period of our history. Yet this thing amazed me most. Not that human beings were afraid of this atomic devilment. That was natural enough. Not that men were frustrated because their blows against the enemy appeared to be so ineffective. Not that patience and determination failed, but that men should surrender without protest the rights of free men, without a real trial of the principles on which their way of life had been based. Democracy had long been the sport of political ballyhoo, but no one could have guessed that its roots were so shallow. The disciplinary devices and, above all, I emphasize again, their easy acceptance revealed the war for what it was, a struggle of imperialisms, differing only from those of centuries ago in the power of their weapons. It was not a contest of ideologies, for each contestant abandoned his own ideology at the first shock." Unquote. In a 1946 Collier's article, Robert DeVore captured the mood of the moment when he wrote that, quote, "Men are beginning to learn that the price of admission to the golden age of the atom will be paid in freedom." Unquote. If you found this episode interesting, entertaining, or a useful sleeping aid, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. This series is only possible through listener support. You can also help by leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify.